Okay, so seems like we're on live now. And it's already 12:15. Let me start by saying I want to welcome everyone to our very first session of this semester's Sociology Department Seminar Series. And we're going to kick off this first session with Patricia Homan, Dr. Patricia Homan. We're very, very honored to have you here. And let me briefly introduce Dr. Homan to you guys. So Patricia Homan is the Assistant Professor of Sociology and the Associate Director of the Public Health Program at Florida State University. And she's also an associate of the FSU's Pepper Institute on Aging and Public Policy and the Center for Demography and Population Health. So Trish's research has been exploring like gender, several factors like gender, race, and even age, like how those factors gave rise to socioeconomic inequalities, and then how all these interactions really influence health outcomes of the American population. And she's certainly a rising star in this field. Just now we're talking about like how people love her work. Her recent 2021 ASR paper is talking about how religion might hurt people's health. And I know Joe is a big fan of that paper, and I also know Hongwei is already citing her work. So we're just very happy to have you here today, Trish. And before I give the floor to Trish, let me just briefly talk about a few housekeeping items here. First of all, our talk will last for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to the audience for a Q&A session. And if you have some quick questions, like quick clarification questions, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom. So let's see. Oh, I don't have this here. So you can use this raising hand feature on Zoom so that Trish can see you. Or if you don't want to interrupt, feel free to put your question in the chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can also put your question in the YouTube chat. Then we can get to it later during the Q&A. But if you want to ask some complicated question, let's save it for later, save it for the Q&A session. And then we're going to discuss them when time permits. So having said all this, let's again give Patricia a big round of applause, and let's give the floor to Patricia now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just really delighted to have a chance to talk with you guys today. And thank you so much for that really generous introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Go. All righty. So my talk today is going to be about structural sexism in health. I thought I would just give you all kind of an overview of the work that I've been doing over the past 2 or 3 years, and then kind of talk a little bit about what's next, how I think the field can build on this work, stuff that I want to do, stuff that I hope other folks will do. So yeah, and feel free to interrupt me. I might not see you right in the chat, so maybe our moderator can help me if I don't notice something. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about, first I'll talk about what is structural sexism. Then I'll talk about how it shapes the health of US men and women. And then we'll talk about how it relates to other systems of oppression. And then finally, how can future studies build on this line of research? So first, what is structural sexism, and why is a structural sexism approach useful? Well, when many people hear the word sexism, they first tend to think about gender discrimination in the workplace, or maybe sexual harassment, or other types of overt interpersonal mistreatment and maybe abuse. So for most people, sexism calls this to mind, and also perhaps maybe things like the Harvey Weinstein scandal and the Me Too movement, perhaps that followed. And it's really important that famous individuals in positions of power are finally being held publicly accountable for their sexism, harassment, and abuse. But it's clear that this is not just an individual problem, right? As the Me Too movement gathered steam and more abuse allegations piled up, here's just a sample graphic from CNN a couple years back of folks who were accused of various kinds of sexual misconduct. But so as this happened, it became clear that it's really not just a few bad apples or something that's happening in a vacuum. Instead, it's systematic and it's a symptom of underlying gendered power structures in our society. So what's underlying this is the current gender distribution of power, status, resources, rights, roles, exposures, and opportunity in our society. It not only enables this type of interpersonal mistreatment that I'm talking about, that most people think of when they think of sexism, but also it has a profound implication for the life chances and health and well-being of all members of society, regardless of whether they're really aware of this sort of gendered inequity in these areas. So this underlying gender structure can affect people through all kinds of mechanisms too, besides directly perceived interpersonal sexist behaviors. And the gender distribution of these valued resources and opportunities can be more or less equitable in any given social context. And so we really need a way of characterizing the extent of systemic gender inequality. And so that's why my work has been focused on developing a structural sexism perspective. So my work is really grounded in theories of gender as a social structure. So here I'm talking about the work of Cecilia Ridgway and Shelley Carell, Barbara Risman, and Pat Martin. So these theories talk about how gender isn't just an individual attribute, but it's a social system of inequality. So here I have laid out for you what gender scholars typically mean when they're talking about gender as a social structure or the gender system. At the macro level, the gender system involves widespread cultural norms and the distribution of resources along gender lines in society's major institutions. At the mesolevel, also often in gender scholarship called the interaction level, the gender system involves interactions and patterns of behavior and organizational practices. So this level is considered really vital to the reproduction of the gender system. At this level, we also have things like Weston Zimmerman's Doing Gender Processes and Ridgway and Smith-Levin's Gender Status Expectations, which are both ways that gender norms and beliefs about gender difference combine with structurally unequal relationships, leading men and women to recreate the unequal gender systems in their everyday interactions. And then finally, at the most micro level of the gender system, we have the individual. And at this level, we have gendered selves, identities, and beliefs, all created through the processes of socialization, internalization, identity work, and the construction of selves. So structural sexism refers to the degree of systematic gender inequality in power and resources in a given gender system. Although most gender systems throughout history have been patriarchal, there is substantial variation in the degree of sexism that they exhibit. So because a gender system is multi-level, we can see structural sexism popping up in these power and resource inequalities at all three levels. So in large-scale social institutions, in organizational and interactional settings, and in individual identities, beliefs, and bodies. And I think of structural sexism as distinct from interpersonal sexist behavior, because it's not just between two people. It's part of a whole system. So in my first attempt at sort of quantifying structural sexism in a multi-level framework like this, I focused on these three areas. At the macro level, US state level institutions, at the meso level, marital dyads, and then at the micro level, individuals and internalized gender ideology that reinforces gender inequality. So here's a list of the specific state level structural sexism indicators that I used. The data came from a variety of administrative sources, including the Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and Guttmacher. So I have 6 different measures across 4 domains, and all of these measures are based on previous research and theory. So before I published this work, there were similar studies of structural racism, and that really kind of inspired this work somewhat. So the economic and political measures I use are really analogous to what I've seen in studies of structural racism. They're the ratio of men's to women's weekly earnings, the ratio of labor force participation, and the feminization of poverty. So the ratio of individuals below the poverty line of women to men. In developing a structural sexism perspective, I added two additional domains, the cultural and the physical or reproductive. For the cultural measure, I used the proportion of the state population that is composed of religious conservatives. And this is an important indicator of structural sexism because these religious institutions relegate women to subordinate roles in the family and in the church, both in their ideology and their practice. And so it's important that the prevalence of religious conservatives gives us a sense of how important these institutions are within a given state level environment. And then finally, because feminist scholars highlight the importance of freedom from physical coercion and behavioral constraint as a foundation for gender equity, I also include the proportion of women who live in a county without an abortion provider. So I standardized and summed these measures to create an overall index of structural sexism. And while this index certainly is not exhaustive, it does capture the major systematic exclusion of women from power and resources in several key areas. My past analyses have shown that the items are highly correlated and that the health effects are not driven by any one indicator, and also are robust to alternative specifications of this index. So on the right, you can see a map that shows which states had the highest and lowest levels of structural sexism index scores. And this is based on each state's mean score over the whole time period that I have data. So from 1998 to 2012, every 2 years. It's in quartiles. So you can see New York, where you guys are, is pretty good in the lowest quartile of structural sexism. For me in Florida, I'm in the second lowest, so not terrible, but not the best. So the highest states are Utah, Wyoming, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The lowest are Maryland, Vermont, Hawaii, and California. So probably no real surprises there, but just notice that there really is significant variation across states. And I'll show you in a minute how this relates to health. But first, why is a structural sexism approach useful? What can it tell us? How can it help us go beyond conventional approaches? So there's a great tradition of gender and health research that looks at gaps between men and women on various health outcomes. So who has more heart disease, men or women? Right? And this research is really important and can tell us in an absolute sense who's healthy and who's not. But the gender gaps are often then used to infer something about social inequality between men and women. But this work can't necessarily tell us all we want to know about how discriminatory gender systems affect health because there's a piece missing, right? And that's most of the time, we're not actually measuring any kind of sexism exposure, because if both men and women live in a society, they're both exposed to certain levels of sexism. So let me give you an example of why this matters. So for now, let's just assume that we're capturing the gender health gap between men and women on some type of health problem at the average level of sexism exposure. But these two dots could be anywhere along the x-axis, but just for argument's sake. So you could have a gap like this in a scenario where structural sexism has no effect, and the health gaps between men and women are attributable to some other factor. You could also have the same gap, but you could have a scenario where sexism is universally harmful for both men and women. Perhaps everyone would be better in a more gender egalitarian environment. And here, these lines need not be necessarily parallel, because perhaps both men and women are harmed, but maybe men to a lesser extent, for example. But you could still have that with the same gap. Or sexism could be bad for women's health while men receive a health benefit. So this is the type of pattern that we might expect based on traditional gender conflict perspectives, where oppressive social relations are seen as a zero-sum game. And yet another scenario could be where women's health is harmed, but men are both advantaged in some respects and disadvantaged in others. So on the whole, sexism has no effect on men. So my point here is that any of these effects are possible with the same observed gender health gap between men and women. And we don't know how discriminatory gender systems are influencing health unless we find a way to measure exposures. So a structural sexism approach can shift the focus from comparisons between men and women to within gender comparisons across levels of exposure to structural sexism. So there is a perceived discrimination approach in previous research that focuses on within gender comparisons primarily among women, but that doesn't tell the full story, right? To the extent that gender discrimination is structural and it's unperceived rather than interpersonal and explicit. So a structural sexism perspective allows us to examine how the unequal gender distribution of power, status, and resources in a society affects the health of all of its members, dominant and subordinate groups, and determine whether patterns are most consistent with theories of zero-sum gender conflict or of universal harm. All right, so what do we actually find? How does structural sexism shape the health of men and women in the US? To answer this question, I used data from the NLSY 79, and I connected that to my sexism measures I just told you about. I looked at 3 different health outcomes: chronic conditions, self-rated health, and physical functioning. I had a variety of individual level and state level controls. And here's what I found. So at the macro level, structural sexism is associated with worse health among both men and women across all 3 health outcomes. So the x-axis here is structural sexism exposure and standard deviations, and the y-axis is poor health or health problems. The stars indicate that the trend is significantly different from 0. But the gender differences here are not statistically significant. Although it looks like for chronic conditions, there's almost a significant difference between men and women in that men are affected somewhat less. So understanding why structural sexism would be harmful for women's health is relatively straightforward, right? Given that they're the oppressed group. Living in a more sexist society is more likely to reduce women's access to health promoting factors like material resources, quality healthcare, self-esteem, autonomy, social support, right? And then also to increase women's exposure to health harming factors like violence, discrimination, the kind of harassment I started out by talking about, but also stress, low subjective social status, all these kinds of things. But you can also see that structural sexism harms men's health as well as women. So the fact that the structural sexism exhibits a pattern of universal harm is really actually consistent with theory and evidence in several related areas of research. So first, there's research on other types of structural inequality in health besides sexism, particularly economic inequality, that indicates that inequality can harm everyone in society because it damages social relationships, increases competition for dominance, undermines safety and productivity and well-being for everyone. So here I'm thinking about like Wilkinson and Pickett and that kind of the spirit level kind of argument. But also there's studies of masculinity and men's health that suggest that patriarchal social systems can foster constructions of masculinity that are toxic, right, for men's health, increasing pressure to engage in risk-taking behaviors and other unhealthy behaviors. So here I'm thinking about work by Connell and Courtenay, the masculinity in health literature. And then finally, there's a whole body of cross-national comparative research in the developing world that shows that gender equity is really important for economic development and population health. So studies show that when women have political power, they often influence social policies in ways that promote education, healthcare, social spending, and all kinds of other expenditures that improve health for the entire population. And then finally, there are structural pluralist perspectives that indicate that bringing a diverse group of voices to the table improves the health of the entire society by shaping public policies that promote universal well-being. So there's all these reasons that actually seeing this effect among men kind of makes sense. But when we look at the mesolevel in the marital dyad, we see something really different. We actually see evidence in support of a gender conflict theory where there are winners and losers. The more unequal a man's marriage is, the better his physical and mental health, whereas the reverse is true for women. So then finally, internalized sexism, as reflected in the sort of gender role ideology, it has no significant effect on men's or women's physical health in this study. So the null findings here may indicate that either the specific gender role beliefs examined here are less important than other aspects of masculinity and gender norms for health. Like they were really focused on women's roles, and so they really didn't tap too much into masculinity. Or it could also be, these null results could be because the individual level may be more associated with non-physical type health outcomes like depression or life satisfaction or things that I haven't considered here. And actually in another study, I do find a relationship between this micro level sexism and women's mental health, but not men's. So these different patterns at the different levels, I think, really highlight the importance of a multi-level systems approach to structural inequality of various kinds. But you might say, wait a minute, what about other mesolevel settings? Maybe marriages are unique. Husbands maybe benefit directly from the labor of their wives in ways that maybe don't hold true for other larger aggregate level inequalities. For example, all men may not necessarily profit to the same degree from the subordination of women in social institutions, let's say. So it remains unclear whether this gender sum or zero sum gender conflict pattern would actually hold in other mesolevel settings, which are not characterized by this dyadic type relationship, where gains from one partner can directly translate to losses for another. So in order to understand that, we actually need to examine structural sexism in some other mesolevel contexts like neighborhoods, workplaces, and organizations. So in a follow-up study with Amy Burdett, which was published in ASR earlier this year, we focused on religious congregations, and here's why. So looking at religious congregations, I think, is a particularly interesting and instructive case because we have decades of research suggesting that religious institutions are beneficial for health and well-being. So participating in a religious organization is good for your health. That finding just is really strongly established. But we also know at the same time that many religious congregations also have very rigid gender-based status hierarchies, right, which can generate a type of mesolevel structural sexism that we think would be really harmful for health, at least among women. But previous research really hasn't considered how these seemingly contradictory patterns relate to one another. So that's what we tried to do in this study. And we used data, we combined two data sets, the General Social Survey and the National Congregation Study. And the way we were able to do this is because actually the NCS was created using a hyper-network sample of GSS respondents. And so there's a link identifier that allows you to link up these data. It's really fascinating data source that I hope more people will use, and you can access by contacting Mark Chaves at Duke University. So we used two waves of that data that had the questions we were interested in. And our outcome here, we only had one health outcome because the GSS is not really a health survey, like data I typically use, and it's self-rated health. And then for our church level structural sexism, we used three different measures, two that are dichotomous and one that's a scale. So the first measure was whether women are permitted or not permitted to serve as a full-fledged member of the congregation's governing board. And this measure of women's representation in governance is particularly important for assessing the relationship between structural sexism and health, just given the accumulating evidence showing that women's political representation is vital for population health in the US and also in other parts of the world. The second measure we use is whether or not women are permitted to serve as the primary religious leader or the head pastor of the congregation. And this is called the stained glass ceiling, this concept that women are sort of blocked in the church from the highest levels of leadership. And so we thought that was particularly important to consider, in part because it's one of the most common types of sexism in a church. About 60% of the congregations did not allow women to be head pastors, whereas only about 15% wouldn't allow them to be on the governing board. And then finally, the last is a sexism scale with it's a count measure that reflects how many of the following things women are prohibited from doing. So the first two that I already told you about, and then also teaching co-ed classes and preaching at a main worship service. So out of those four things, how many roles are women prohibited from occupying? And what we found was that, we wanted to know, is congregational sexism related to health among attenders? And the answer is yes for women, but no for men. Women who attended sexist religious institutions had worse self-rated health than those who attended more inclusive congregations. And if you look at the results among men, they're actually trending towards women, but they're not significantly different from zero. But they're also not significantly different from women. So it's kind of a sticky situation. I don't know if others of you have ever found this in your research, where you have an interaction effect that's non-significant, but you also have a main effect that's non-significant, but then the other group is significant. So, depending upon which null hypothesis we consider most important, we would come to different conclusions. So if we really think it's most important that we test men's effect against zero, we would say it doesn't matter for men. But if we think that the difference between men and women is the thing we should be testing, and that's non-significant, then we would assume, that congregational sexism does harm men because they're not different from women who have a statistically significant effect. So in order to sort of deal with the limits, I guess, of hypothesis testing and sort of traditional frequentist statistics, we decided to go with a Bayesian analysis and see if we could learn anything more from it. And what the Bayesian analysis allows us to do is actually to make more detailed probabilistic statements about how likely certain scenarios are. So these plots summarize the posterior distributions for the effects of sexism among men and women for the three different measures. So let me explain a little bit, just in case you haven't seen something like this before. Basically, the distributions clearly show that there's a negative effect of sexism on health because most of the values are below zero. So if you can see this zero line in each plot, especially for women, almost all of the values are below zero. The distributions indicate that the most likely scenario for men is that they also exhibit a negative effect of sexism on health, but the magnitude of that effect is smaller than that of women. So basically, we could calculate the probabilities that men's effect is less than zero, meaning that there's a negative effect, that it's harmful. And the probabilities are, 98, 99%. So it's very likely that there is a negative effect among men. But if you see, I can also calculate the probability that their effect is smaller than women's. And depending upon the measure we use for sexism, you can see that it's between 99 and 79%. So really likely to be less, between zero and women's effect size. All right, now for our second question was, how does this compare to the health of non-attenders? And what we found is that women who attend inclusive religious institutions exhibit a health advantage relative to non-participants, but not women who attend sexist congregations. So this suggests that the long recognized health benefits of religious participation do not extend to groups that are systematically excluded from power and status in their religious institutions. So this is important because we wanted to try to understand which effect is bigger or stronger, which matters more if they go head to head, the harmful effects of sexism or the positive benefits of religious participation. And so, yeah, our answer is that you only get a benefit if you're in an inclusive congregation, but you're not actually significantly worse off than non-attenders if you are in a sexist congregation. So they kind of cancel out, I guess you could say. All right, so to summarize the health consequences of structural sexism that I found in my work so far, basically, structural sexism in state institutions, in marriages, and in religious congregations are all harmful for women's health. But among men, state-level sexism is harmful, intramarital sexism is beneficial, and sexism in religious congregations, this sort of middle ground, seems to have either a very small effect or no effect. Now, the next question I've begun to think about is, how does structural sexism relate to other types of structural inequality and other types of systems of oppression? And I think this is a question that we're really only just beginning to start answering. But when we think about how inequalities intersect, obviously the most important theory to think about is intersectionality theory. And the core insight of intersectionality is the recognition that individuals' experiences are shaped not by one single status hierarchy, but by multiple overlapping systems of oppression. So racism, sexism, economic exploitation, and many other forms of oppression intersect to shape individual lives in complex ways. So that's the insight of intersectionality, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. In terms of work that I do, intersectional approaches to population health have been growing over the past 15 years. I'd say there's a growing body of intersectional research in medical sociology, and it's generated some really major contributions to our knowledge of health disparities by showing the ways that health is jointly shaped by these interlocking systems of race, class, and gender stratification in particular. But what's important to note about this literature is that while intersectional health disparities research conceptually reflects systemic inequalities, the measurement has really focused on individual level. So the vast majority of empirical research in this area basically just uses individual level social statuses. So Black woman, white man, low SES, right? Individual status categories as proxies for systems of exposure. They haven't actually measured these systems directly in any intersectional health disparities research, or very widely. But there are these several emerging lines of work that point to promising new ways that we can measure systems of oppression at a macro level. So in addition to my work on structural sexism, there's this parallel line of research on structural racism that really informed my approach and that I've been sort of engaging with in other projects. And then there's also a really important line of income inequality and health. These studies tend to measure inequalities, structural inequalities at the US state level, not always, but typically. And what they find is that these structural inequalities are harmful for health, sometimes for everyone and sometimes only for the subordinated group. So there's growing interest in these types of structural approaches, but so far, they've only examined a single type of structural inequality at a time. So we really need a synthesis of structural and intersectional approaches for population health. And this will expand intersectional work by allowing us to capture variation in systemic oppression across time and space and actually measuring it in ways that status category proxies don't allow us to. And then it will also help us refine structural inequality in health literature by integrating these core insights of intersectionality that have been lacking so far in structural sexism or structural racism research. So in a new article just published this month in the special issue of the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, we advocate for the development of a structural intersectionality approach. We sort of argue that a structural intersectionality approach to population health will answer at least two questions. First, how do systems of oppression vary and relate to one another at a macro level? And then how do these structural inequalities jointly shape the health of various population groups that are defined by constellations of individual level statuses? So we see this really as like an early foray into quantitative structural intersectionality in health research. And so we did choose the classic examples of axes of inequality of race, class, and gender, and we just focus on those three and their intersections. So to answer the first question, we explore how measures of structural racism, sexism, and income inequality intersect in US states. To our knowledge, no other study had measured these three types of structural inequality and investigated this before. And then also the second question, to answer that question, we combine these state level measures with health and demographic data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the BRFIS, to investigate how these types of structural inequality combine to shape the health of Black men, Black women, and white men. And given how little empirical research exists on this topic, it's unclear whether there are differential health consequences of overlapping systems of oppression. So on the one hand, a universal harm perspective might predict that structural inequalities have broad-based harmful effects on population health, but intersectionality perspectives would suggest that these overlapping systems would be particularly harmful for groups who occupy a variety of subordinate statuses. So, and perhaps some types of structural inequality are universally harmful while others are vary more according to social position. So we investigate these issues to try to get a better understanding of macro level structural intersectionality and how it affects health. So this is a lot of words on a slide, but I'll just like sort of briefly tell you that these are the measures that we've used. So the structural sexism measures are at the state level, and I already explained them to you. They're the same ones from the 2019 study. The structural racism measures are similar. They are actually ones we developed in another paper that's been languishing in the review process for a year or two now. But they're based on Lukashko, Hatzenbuehler, and Keyes. They're sort of groundbreaking work on structural racism. And we've added some of our own. And then you'll see the income inequality. It's not really a robust, well-developed, like sort of theoretical measure of structural classism yet. It's really what exists in the literature now already, which is just the income inequality. So we just focus on that here. But that's definitely an area for our future work. So this map shows the different types of structural inequalities across US states. And this is in 2010, which was the last census data year until recently. Structural racism tends to be highest in the Midwest and Northeast. And this is consistent with prior studies showing that these regions have especially high levels of racial inequality in sort of education, housing, and judicial domains. But it's still surprising because we think of the South as being more racist, but maybe it's more culturally racist and not necessarily in the way that we're defining structural racism here. And you can see that structural sexism is highest in the Southern and Rocky Mountain regions. And then finally, the income inequality tends to be the highest along both coasts and in states with large populations and major cities like New York, California, Florida, Texas. So I think what's really interesting is that the most sexist states are not the most racist states, are not the most economically unequal states. So we often think about these processes working together, but they do sort of take shape differently across the US. And when we actually look at the correlations between our measures, there's surprisingly very little overlap. Before seeing these correlations, we might have logically expected the types of structural inequality to be positively correlated. But a handful of studies have examined the relationship between contextual level racial and gender inequality just in earnings and have found either a negative correlation or no correlation. So we find that there are relatively weak to moderate negative correlations among structural racism, sexism, and income inequality. And this really suggests that distinct processes are at work in generating these systems of oppression, at least in terms of their manifestations in US states. All right, so how do these intersecting structural inequalities jointly shape the health of various population groups? Well, what we did to sort of get at their intersections is we dichotomized these structural inequalities into high-low, and then created an 8-category system where individuals could live in states that were low on all three, racism, sexism, and Gini, or were high on all three, or were high and low in various combinations. I know this is kind of a lot to take in, but basically the key takeaway, first of all, the figure shows the predicted self-rated health values for each group in context characterized by these different combinations of high and low levels of the structural inequalities. The red bands show the confidence interval around the all low estimate, just as a baseline, so we can see which combinations are significantly different from that and for whom. The key takeaway here is that Black women have the worst self-rated health and are the most affected by the various types of structural inequality, while white men tend to have better self-rated health than Black men and women and are unaffected by the intersecting structural inequalities largely. Okay, so to summarize structural intersectionality, basically, these structural inequalities vary considerably across US states, and they intersect in a variety of ways, but don't necessarily strongly or positively co-vary. They do jointly shape health, but they do so differentially along race and gender lines, and are most consistently associated with poorer health among Black women. So our analysis here isn't really intended to be an end-all be-all, but instead to be illustrative of how a structural intersectionality approach can sort of point us in a useful new direction. And speaking of new directions, how can future studies build on this emerging line of research? I think there are really sort of 3 main areas that I'm going to highlight and elaborate on a bit. So the first, so broadening inquiry, thinking intersectionally, and incorporating a life course lens. So first, broadening inquiry. These measures that I chose of structural sexism, I only have 6. There could be so many more, right? I just chose them because I needed ones that were available across a long historical period to match up with my NLSY data in my original study. And so I wanted them to be consistent across time and available. But there are all kinds of interesting ways that we could measure structural sexism. I'm aware of some great new research. One published in AJPH last month that looks at structural sexism and healthcare access. And they added some new measures. They added a measure for whether there is laws against gun ownership among domestic violence perpetrators. And they also added whether there is paid work family leave. So there's all kinds of things that we might add in terms of expanding our sexism measures. The other thing is that we can really broaden our health outcomes and look at all kinds of other things. I personally am really interested in looking at biomarkers and cognitive function. I also have another analysis that's not published yet that looks at life expectancy. And I actually find that women in high sexism states live 6 years shorter than women in low sexism states. And I find a similar pattern for men, except the effect is half the size. So it's a 3-year difference in life expectancy. So I think there's a lot of other health outcomes we could consider. There's also a brand new paper just out in Social Science and Medicine, again, not by me, but some other folks who look at structural sexism and C-sections, unnecessary C-sections. I think that one's really fascinating. So that's in Social Science and Medicine. And then I think that a structural sexism approach can really be useful for other sociologists beyond health. Like, I'm really interested in health because that's what I study and that's what my training is in. But you can hopefully see how measuring this kind of contextual level gender inequality would be relevant for all kinds of other outcomes that sociologists care about, and all kinds of other maybe structural factors as well. So that's ways we can broaden our inquiry. Also, thinking intersectionally. So, we started by trying to develop this structural intersectionality approach, but we really only are just starting. We use race, class, and gender, but there are so many other systems of oppression and intersections we might look at. So heterosexism, cissexism, ableism, nativism, ageism, all these things, right, could be measured in a systemic way and then looked at the different intersections. Obviously, in any single study, you can't look at too many intersections or things turn into a complicated mess really quickly, actually. But still, this is going to be, I think, a really important area to pursue for the future. In my own work, I have one study of looking at how sexism and heterosexism are combined and are both really part of a system of heteropatriarchy that privileges heterosexual men and subordinates women and LGBTQ people. And we actually develop a new measure of heteropatriarchy by combining structural stigma, structural sexism, and more abortion access indicators. And we look at how this affects birth outcomes. And so this study is forthcoming in demography, if anyone's interested in that. Probably won't be out until next year. And then, so I think there's just a lot of interesting things we can do thinking intersectionally. One more thing is that we could think about not just how structural measures like structural racism and structural sexism intersect, but we could also think about how we might measure these structural inequalities with intersectionality in mind. So what I mean is, for example, like Whitney Pirtle had an article about structural gendered racism, right? So the actual measure is intersectional rather than seeing how these inequalities intersect. So I think that's another really interesting direction. It might not be relevant to all different types of inequalities, but certainly with structural gendered racism, you can imagine that it could be measured in its own way. And then finally, applying a life course lens also represents an important opportunity for future research. For example, life course scholars would ask questions like, is sexism and other structural inequalities, are they particularly harmful during certain stages of the life course? Are there lagged health effects of exposure to intersecting structural inequalities or sexism? Does duration of exposure matter? How does like intergenerational transmission happen? Does structural sexism in your parents' marriage as a kid affect you as an adult, right? All of these things could be really interesting. So I think there's just a lot of more exciting work to be done to build on all this research. So thank you so much for having me. And that is all I have for you today. I just want to give a quick shout out to my wonderful co-authors who helped been a part of these various projects I've mentioned today. And then also the Network on Life Course Health Dynamics and Disparities in 21st Century America has funded some of this work with a grant. So shout out to them and thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Trish. What a fascinating and ambitious project. I was really impressed by their multi-level system. Like you studied the effect of structural sexism through those different like disaggregated effect into different levels, and I was really impressed by that. And when I was listening to that, I was already wondering how would this effect actually being moderated by racism, income inequality. And surprisingly, you're already introducing this fascinating intersectionality approach. I'm really, really excited about that. And I think this is a promising approach. And it's really ambitious and I really, really love it. And I would like to take advantage of my presetter's role and throw out a quick question first before we really open the floor to the audience. So this is just a very quick question. I know that just now we've introduced the effect of structural sexism on different levels. And it seems like the effect is pretty coherent for women, right? It's just harmful in general. But for men, the picture is kind of like a bit messier. Like on the macro level, it's harmful, but on the meso level, it depends on which institutions we're talking about, right? And on the individual level, it seems like no to little effect. So I'm just wondering, what is the net effect for men, this structural sexism? What's your take on that?
Why it's so messy? Like
no, it's not why it's so messy. I'm like, what's the net effect of
the net effect? Got it.
Yeah,
okay.
for men.
Well, that's a good question. To look at the net effect, you need to have all of them in the same model,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which I did have in the ASR piece, and I did find that the effects were additive because there were no interactions between effects, and they didn't necessarily cancel each other out. So I guess to calculate any specific man's health, you'd have to use the regression coefficients for your state level sexism and your marriage level sexism. But what I think is interesting is that in the religious congregation study, we're only focused on religious congregations, like that one mesolevel piece. And that actually speaks to why I think it might be kind of a null effect, because a religious congregation is a little bit like a state in that, there's a bunch of people, we're all in this together. We can have certain things that benefit our well-being or not. But to the extent that these religious congregations maybe support sexism in the home, in marriages and families, then maybe it benefits men. So maybe it's like harmful to be in an environment that like sort of has this sexism, but then it personally benefits them at home. And so maybe that's what's offsetting it there. I don't know if that really fully answers your question, but those are the kind of things I'm thinking about. And I think we just need more research to know. And I find similar things in the research on structural racism too. A lot of times you always see that it's harmful for Black people in the US, obviously, but for white people, a lot of times you find no effect. And sometimes I've found once before that they benefited. And a couple of studies do. So I think it's just less clear cut with the dominant group.
Yes, I appreciate.
And it also might be that something we had never tested before, that it interacts with socioeconomic status. So, or whiteness or something, if we're talking about gender. So maybe only high SES white men are really benefiting from sexism, structural sexism in a lot of ways, or consistently, and sort of other men are benefiting less.
Yeah, totally. This just shows us this is really, again, a very promising approach, a very promising project, and there is just a lot to explore yet. And okay, let's open the floor to the audience. And I see Joe already raised his hand. Joe, please.
Hi, I had a question about the durability of marriages that are highly sexist, because I'd wonder if not being married incurs a lot of at least economic costs, and getting divorced certainly does. Is something like that at work? That was my first question. I wanted to make a comment that on your previous exchange about the deal that men have. It strikes me a lot like single family detached housing. It's like it's something that's bad for society in general, but the people who have it at the moment have a very particular vested interest, and probably everybody would be better off were people to let go of that position of privilege, but it's human nature to just anchor on to something that you have. It really strikes me a lot like single family detached housing.
Wow, that is like such an interesting and apt analogy. I'm like fascinated by that.
What about the length of marriages? Like, do unequal marriages, do they stay together for a long time? Does that affect your findings at all?
Well, so I do control for whether they divorce during the period or not. So that's just the way I deal with it. But I'm not a specialist in marriage scholarship and how it relates to health. Maybe people like Deb Umberson are really good at knowing how marriage relates to health. But I will tell you one thing that we do know is that marriage is more beneficial for men's health than for women's. And probably because they benefit men more. They're often sexist. So I didn't show you these figures, but I think it's in the paper. But the average marriage is much more sexist, just on average. Like men have 2 more years of education, like $40,000 more of income, and are 5 years older or something like that, or 2 years older on average, just in the average marriage. So there's a lot of inequality there. And I definitely think that it affects, the longevity of these marriages, but it's not something I've studied beyond like just trying to control for it in my analysis. So.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, so, okay, Hongwei, go ahead.
Oh, this is fascinating. I don't know how I missed your already published articles. So I'll definitely read them.
A lot of them are brand new, so
that's okay. Why I'm surprised I missed them. Anyway, I have several questions, but I got interrupted by my kids' teachers' class dojo message, so I got lost. But I guess first question is it's related to Joe's question at the micro level. I wonder if there's a selection bias into let's say in terms of marriage, right? So I guess maybe women who have developed a more kind of like a stereotypical gender role or gender ideology at young ages are more likely to marry men who are more masculine. Like so I guess I'm not sure about like a macro level how the structural sexism operates against this kind of possibility of selection bias. There's a map you show comparing. I think it's your new GHSB article that looks at structural racism, sexism, and that makes me wonder if you are measuring basically inequalities, right? And I'm thinking about there are two possibilities of equalities. So like maybe in terms of income, it could be certain states that are equally poor, so there's no economic inequality there. While in maybe some other states, everyone is rich, so there's also little income inequality. But in states like New York and California, there are huge income inequality. So I'm trying to think about whether this kind of different types of equality also applies to structural sexism or structural racism, and how that may factor into your study. So I guess I'll just ask those two questions for now. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think you're definitely right about selection into marriages based on your individual level beliefs, at least somewhat, right, to some degree. Yeah, and I don't really know how to account for that necessarily in the analysis that I've done, but it's definitely something interesting to look at going forward. I do think that out of the levels, the micro level is the one that needs the most development right now. Like I kind of had to go with just whatever I could find out there because I was a graduate student, and using available data. But I'm definitely interested in thinking about ways where we could measure internalized gender inequality that's embodied in terms of our own beliefs about ourselves or the way we physically interact with the world or all kinds of things. I think could be really interesting to look at the individual level and the selection, back and forth between them. I mean, it's also useful to be able to include all the different levels in the same model, but that's not always possible. But I do think that it would be great to see a lot more work on that. But related to your second question, what was it? Oh, about so you're absolutely right that when we look at these ratio measures, like black to white ratio of poverty or unemployment, right? It can be, you can have a situation where the gap is small because everyone's unemployed, or the gap is small because everyone is employed. And so that is, something I think that we need to think through in this research, what it means and whether we want to capture that or control for that or not, and sort of the implications of that. I would say that all of this research is really still in its infancy, and I think everyone's developing their own measures and way of thinking about these structural inequalities, and something we've thought a lot about, Tyson, Brown, and I. And we've thought maybe we should control for the overall level of, say, unemployment or something, but there's just way too much collinearity. By the time you control for the overall level and the black level and the white level, or the ratio, it just nothing ever, the models don't work. So I think that it's kind of I don't know, just like a feature of the measurement, and whether it's a good or bad thing, I think remains to be seen, I guess. But it's definitely an important thing to point out.
Yes. Just to piggyback on Hongwei's earlier point about the selection bias, when I was listening to the talk, I was also wondering, because you use self-rated health as the outcome variable, and I was wondering whether that will also introduce some, unconscious bias into it, because some women, they might be more sensitive about their own health, right? But a counter argument could be women are all caregivers, tend to ignore their own health. So like it's also about their self-perception of their own body, their own health, and this is also probably influence the outcome.
Yeah, so self-rated health is a really interesting measure, and when I do research like this, I try to include multiple types of health outcomes. So like in the first ASR, we have self-rated health, chronic conditions, and physical functioning, which is like the SF-12 scale that asks people like how well they can do these various tasks. And we find, similar effects across all three. But I do think, especially for the micro level, the internalized like gender role beliefs for men, you could imagine how like being strong and like healthy and manly is, a part of masculinity. And so that would lead men to sort of bias their rating of their self-rated health higher than maybe it actually should be. So I think that's a case where the gender perception really matters. And so I think it'd be really interesting to look at that compared to other types of physical or mental health outcomes as well. I have another paper where I'm looking at like depressive symptoms specifically at these different levels and across gender too. Because, there's like a big gender difference in depressive symptoms where women are much more depressed than men.
Yeah. This is just, again, fascinating. And this disparity between people's own perception and then their real objective, health indicators. I think this is also a very interesting point to see. We still have some time. If you have any question, feel free to raise hand or just unmute yourself and speak up.
Oh, I want to say one more thing. That's one of the reasons why I'm interested in biomarkers is because it's an objective, analysis of like men's and women's health, especially at like midlife and sort of early to like portions of later life around retirement age. And you don't have to go to the doctor for it, right? It was just collected as part of the health and retirement study. So I think that'd be a really interesting chance to sort of see like how well the perceived health aligns with things like biomarkers and stuff that doesn't involve going to a doctor or assessing your own health.
Totally. Yeah, that's the future approach. I see, and you could also use life expectancy, those easy indicators, but they're more objective than self-rated health.
I'll jump. Okay. Yeah, I'm so interested in your work. So I would make one suggestion that in addition to biomarkers, you may want to look at the psychological health outcomes first, because I suspect that structural sexism affect people's psychological health first, which in turn, creates chronic stress and then, lead to deteriorate the physical health functioning. So so I think in addition to biomarkers, maybe mental health outcomes are also important, and maybe that should, I don't know, that would be my first thing to look for.
It would also be interesting to do mental and physical health like in the same model and see like how they're related to one another and whether that, relates to. I have done an analysis that I just have never had time to write up and publish on depressive symptoms that basically does exactly what I did in that first ASR with the macro, meso, and micro level. And the patterns are almost identical. The biggest difference is that the mesolevel effect among men is really strong for mental health. So like if men are earning less money or are less educated or like younger than their wives, they're like super depressed, right? Like if their marriage is like really in the woman's favor, like unequal, in that way, they're just like their depressive symptoms are really high. And then also at the micro level, there is an effect of micro level structural sexism on women's depression. So women who sort of adhere to these more traditional gender role beliefs are more depressed, but there's no effect among men. So that's the key differences I find. I just haven't had a chance to get it out into the world.
I'll be very looking forward to that paper, the depression among men and women, and how men will be so depressed. I mean, that's just very expected. That's what we observe, but there's no paper on that. Hongwei, are you gonna say something? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the framework you built, but empirically, I'm actually working on a different direction. So because I think as you also alluded, like having so many things in the same like model, right, could create some kind of chaos. And in my work, I'm trying to focus on like one aspect of structural sexism, which is the political inequality. So I think that's one of the domain that you included in your construction of the structural sexism scale. So I'm curious whether you have compared like the different domains of the structural sexism and say which domain kind of matters more than the others. Yeah.
Did I used to have a slide that had like the estimates from each one. I mean, I think there wasn't any one that was like so much stronger than the others, but I would say that the political one is pretty consistently important for most outcomes that I've looked at. So that's actually where I originally started. My first paper I ever published myself in graduate school was Political Gender Inequality and Infant Mortality in US states. So that one really just focused on women's political underrepresentation. So I do think that that's like super important on its own and worthy of study, especially because that really shapes policy in a lot of ways, not just health policy, but social policy too.
Yeah, that's a paper I cited in my work.
Just curious. So in this structural sexism index, this scale, this is also related to Hongwei's question. So we have like different components. Did you give different weight to different components, or they're all equal?
So they're all equal there, but I did some measurement models, like using structural equation modeling, and they all like loaded on one factor. And then the results I got like weren't really different depending on whether I went with like a fancy measurement model or a just a standard summed index. And so the reason I ended up not going with the measurement model is because, as far as I understand, there's not a good way to allow for interactions between latent variables. I could be wrong, or that could have changed since the time that I wrote this, but I wasn't aware of an approach that allowed you to interact latent variables. And some of my key hypotheses were like, is there an interaction between, marital level sexism and macro level sexism? And so I wanted to test those in the paper. So that's kind of why I went with a more simple index sum approach. And so they all are weighted equally. But I mean, I think depending on what people do in the future, what kinds of measures they want to add, it might be really important to weight them differently and to do some more careful measurement models. So in our racism index, the one I showed for this paper that I presented today was also just a standardized sum. But in our actual paper that's still under review forever, we do a measurement model for structural racism.
Gotcha. Great. We're at 1:23 now, still like a few more minutes. If you have any question, please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask.
Wait, before Barbara goes, I have to leave for 1:30, but thank you very much for joining us, Patricia, and thank you for organizing this, Yinxuan.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the technical support. Thanks. Yeah. All right, Barbara. Barbara, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much, Trish, for your paper. And I've read a couple of your articles, and I'm extremely impressed with your work. So I have just a couple like real quick questions, largely because I do something somewhat similar in an international context. So my first question is about your focus on really Christian Protestant, conservative congregations. And so I'm wondering if you would find something similar, or if you've thought about exploring similar data on other religions or even other denominations within Christianity? And then my second question has to do with your health measures. And if I understood, please correct me if I misunderstood you, because my computer died in the middle of this. But right, are you? All of your measures seem to be subjective measures of health as opposed to objective measures of health. And it's not necessarily a critique, because I understand how difficult that would be, but have you considered that? And then I have a third question, just as a thought question going forward. I'm so old, I have to kind of keep asking these questions so that the younger generation and younger scholars will be able to pick up on some of the threads. So have you thought about using the more standard international measures of gender inequality, like the GII or the Series scale or something like that, that would allow for real expansion and comparability in global studies? So those are my three questions. But thank you for your work. I mean, I'm very impressed and very excited by it.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. Those are great questions and really great points. So in terms of like other religious traditions, like the data just weren't there for me to look at it. But in terms of the number of people in those other types of religious groups, are smaller in the US. And so having enough people represented in the like GSS subsample that connects to the National Congregation Study or in the Health and Retirement Study, there just wasn't enough of those religious traditions, like people adherence to those religious traditions, to make a measure of that. But I think it's definitely something that could be looked at in the future with more effort, though I think it would be difficult, especially because I think there might be some states that have maybe a high prevalence of certain types of religious traditions, but not consistently across all US states. So that, again, could be difficult. But looking specifically within congregations, I think could definitely be done by like a religion scholar or someone with expertise in that area. So I think that's a great point. And then in terms of the like objective versus subjective measures, I would say that the measures that I use from the NLSY 79 are somewhere in between objective and subjective, most of them. I mean, self-rated health is very subjective, right? Although we know that it's one of the best predictors of mortality. So it really is reliable and valid, but it is subjective. But the other measures are, has a doctor ever diagnosed you with heart disease, diabetes, stroke? Those are like the chronic conditions. So, I mean, they are self-reported. The person has to report them, but they are sort of more objective in that they rely on diagnoses. So I guess they'd be somewhere in between. And the same with the SF-12 functioning scale. So it's very specific rather than sort of a global subjective indicator of health. I'll also note that in a project I have not published yet, I do use life expectancy. I estimate life expectancy, like I said, and that's obviously objective because I know when people are dead from the death registry. So they're not reporting that. But I think it's really important to get a mix of objective and subjective measures and to think about how that might relate to the gender differences we're seeing. Like we discussed, like it might really matter, especially for men who have strong masculinity beliefs, right? And then in terms of like international comparative work, definitely, I think you raise a really important point about using the GEM or the GII or one of those international measures. I think the reason I didn't do that at first was because when I first started this project, there was no available data for the US on those measures. Like typically they were focused like in other parts of the world, especially the developing world. And like the US, we think of ourselves as being egalitarian, but we're pretty terrible. We're like 54th in the world for gender equity or something. And even worse for women's political representation. So I think it's really important that we look at it in the US. And I do think it would be great to develop analogous measures of of the GII at the state level over time. So I'd be interested in if that exists, like hearing about it. If not, like working with people to gather it could be really fascinating. That could be like a big grant that, you know, we put in at some point. But I definitely think it's a really important point, because then it would be nice to be able to compare to other countries, and especially to compare US states to other countries. I find that to be really interesting, because state level environments now are just so dramatically different. Since the 1980s, they've really diverged in terms of their health and sort of policy profiles. And so that'd just be really interesting.
Do I have time for one more comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just really quickly, thank you very much. And I just, if I could make a couple of, I see Holly knows a lot more than I do about this, but, and I'm sorry, we've lost the facial. But so some of the things that might be really interesting are infant birth weights and maternal mortality, fertility rates. So these are all the things that you can find in these international scales. And I think they give us a really nice set of objective indicators short of, the outcomes of people's physical exams. And a lot of those data are available on, you have an expert in your faculty down there, James Cavendish. And so the Thearta Sociology Religion database has a lot of that information on it.
I guess maybe the reason why some of those things don't make it into my sexism index is it's sort of like a gray area for me, because they seem like maybe they should be outcomes, right? Like birth weight or maternal mortality are health outcomes, but they're also like could be indicators of sexism. So that's another sort of tricky, like theoretical thing to think about.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I've read your articles, and I'll read more of them because I really appreciate your work, and I think it's very promising, and I actually got a lot of ideas from you. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. It's been really fun visiting with you guys.
Thank you. Okay, so while it's already 1:30, let's conclude this talk with a big round of another, big applause for Trish. And thank you so much. What a great start of the seminar. This is our very first session, and it was completely very successful. And I also appreciate all of you here. I'm very happy to see all of you here, and I appreciate the support. Then, all right, I think we can just conclude the session right now. And thank you again, Trish. And feel free to sign off now, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. You can always reach out to me by email at phoman@fsu.edu.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me type your email to the chats, probably, in case someone need that.
All right. You could Google me too.
Oh, that's true. Wait, never mind. Now we're just leaving for people to just Google it in case I spell it. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Trish.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye.